Rick Gaillardet's contributions to Catholic theology. As you have heard, I was a student here at Boston College from 2013 to 2021. First as a master's student at the STM, and then as a doctoral student. During this time, I took, I think, every graduate seminar that Dr. Gaillardet offered. I wrote my dissertation on the Church as the Body of Christ under his direction, and I even had the great fun of assisting him in the editorial work for the Cambridge Companion to Vatican II, where, as I've noted, we both discovered that I have a rather freakish love for indexing books. And so, naturally, many of our conversations over the years have focused on specific questions in ecclesiology or the latest news or document from Rome. But some of my favorite conversations in his office have been on the topic of vocation, especially whether or not there is such a vocation as the single life. At times, these have even been lively disagreements. By now, though, we both acknowledge that we are more or less 95% in agreement on a theology of vocation in general, but there is just 5% that I will not let go of. And so my paper today comes out of these extended conversations. I will start by lifting up Rick's contribution to the theology of vocation as a call to Christian friendship, which he develops in reference to marriage and religious life. I then want to explore how his work on vocation and marriage offers important resources for single people and can help us develop a way of speaking about the vocation of the single life. This is the point where Rick and I have our minor difference or disagreement. But it is my hope that the greatest way a student can honor their teacher is to expand beyond the teacher's own thought in new directions, as our conference title suggests. Rick develops his theology of vocation primarily in his book, A Daring Promise, A Spirituality of Christian Marriage, which I think is not available outside, so find it on Amazon in print or as audiobook, which I have not listened to. And in a handful of other articles and book chapters. His most recent article on the topic was published this past January under the title, I Call You Friends, Toward a New Theology of Vocation. In this article, Rick challenges the approach to vocation that dominated in the 20th century and prior, which understood vocation as state of life. There were three possible vocations or states of life: priesthood, religious life, and marriage. As Rick notes, within that framework, marriage was imagined as the default vocation of the vast majority of believers, while the vocations to priesthood and religious life were presented as elevated and more heroic vocations. He sees two problems with this approach today. First of all, it still evokes a kind of hierarchy of holiness, which Vatican II explicitly rejects when it emphasizes the universal call to holiness. And second, at least in contemporary US culture, marriage is no longer viewed as a given, since a rising number of adults are delaying marriage or foregoing it altogether. In response, Rick argues that we need a new theology of vocation, one that can, quote, illuminate the full dimensions of the universal call to holiness, and within which discernment regarding the more specific vocations to marriage or religious life will be undertaken, end quote. He proposes that Christian friendship provides this more comprehensive theological framework. The category of friendship, more so than states of life, captures what all of us are called to by virtue of our baptism. Drawing on the work of mystics and theologians, Rick holds that the human person is fundamentally a desiring creature. We are shaped by eros. We long for union with God and others. But where Rick distinguishes his thought from more traditional strains of Catholic or magisterial anthropology, this eros, he says, quote, is not oriented primarily towards genital sexual consummation and procreation, but toward loving, mutual, vulnerable relationships with others. That is, toward a life of Christian friendship, end quote. Friendship for Gaillardet is marked by fidelity, caring, commitment, tenderness, intimacy, mutuality, trust, and appropriate vulnerability. Authentic friendships with others draw us into and are expressions of friendship with the divine. In other words, marriage is not the default vocation for the Christian or the primary object of our desire for communion. Friendship is. Against this background, marriage and religious life are particular forms of friendship, shaped by public and lifelong vows. Marriage is a sacramental friendship marked not only by the fidelity, caring, and mutuality of all friendship, but also by exclusive sexual intimacy. In A Daring Promise, Rick expands the spirituality of marriage as friendship in much greater detail. He offers moving reflections on the ways in which marriage is an ongoing call to conversion, and how the choice of a lifelong commitment to one other flawed, vulnerable person is an invitation into both the Paschal mystery and into intimacy and communion that reflects the divine life. Religious life, in turn, is evangelical friendship. The vow of consecrated celibacy frees the religious to enter into a peculiar form of Christian friendship, both with others in her religious community and with the broader church and social community. What both forms of life have in common is that they are particular life forms of the common call to friendship. As Rick puts it, friendship is the genus, marriage and religious life are the species. Now, I mentioned at the outset that Rick and I are 95% in agreement on the theology vocation, so where do we diverge? My point of disagreement with him and where I'd like to develop his work in new directions is on his position that there's no such thing as a vocation to the single life. Allow me to quote him at length here. Sorry. He writes, "I am not convinced there is, in fact, a vocation to the single life, if for no other reason than that people are single for such widely divergent reasons. Some are single as an interim state, hoping to one day marry. Others wish to remain single as a permanent lifestyle choice. Still others are single by reason of divorce or the death of a spouse. I am inclined against positing a distinct single vocation because from a Christian theological perspective, no one is ever really single. All of us are called to loving relationship with others. Indeed, all of us are called to a life of friendship." Elsewhere, he writes that a theology of vocation must not begin with some preliminary state of singleness, which some may embrace as a permanent calling, but rather with the life of friendship. That's the end of the long quotes. In response, I would like to suggest that the single life is the life of friendship. Indeed, it is the first form of friendship that any of us undertake, and so is the first vocation, and is the one to which most of us will return at some point in our lives. So although Rick himself does not posit the single life as a vocation, I find that his work is actually a rich resource for doing just that. To make my case, one clarification needs to be made at the outset here. Single does not mean isolated individual or monad or alone. I think this is how Rick has heard the term and is the main source of our disagreement. Rather, the single person is the person embedded in community, in relationship with God and self and others, without a public, exclusive, and lifelong vow of friendship to one other person or community. In fact, this is the life form we all live for the first 20 or 30 or more years of our lives. Our early lives are marked primarily by familial relationship with parents and siblings, but as we move through adolescence, teenage years, college years, and beyond, our lives are increasingly defined by adult friendships. This remains the case until, or if, one enters into marriage or religious life, when those relationships take center stage. But even for those who marry, it is nearly guaranteed that at some point, one spouse will return to being single, though in quite a different form when the spouse dies. What is distinctive about the call to friendship in the single life is the possibility for breadth, just as the friendship of marriage is marked by depth. Precisely because I do not have a primary affective relational commitment to one other person, nor to a religious community, I can cultivate the gift of friendship with a wider community. When a person takes on vows of either marriage or religious life, their affective horizon, in the language of Sandra Schneider's, narrows and becomes more specific. The spouse and children, or in the religious context, the relationship with Christ and community, that rightly becomes the primary context of one's loving commitment and care, of growth in discipleship and holiness and the pursuit of one's salvation. For the single person, this affective horizon can and must be much wider. Precisely because I do not have a spouse or children of my own, nor vows of poverty or obedience, I can give much more time, emotional investment, and even financial support to my friends, most of whom are married with children, and to colleagues and neighbors and to my broader community. I could not count the number of times I've provided childcare on short notice for friends in need, the number of airport drop-offs and pickups I've done because my daily schedule is not governed by nap times and swim practice, the miles I've driven because I know it is easier for me to travel to my friends with young kids than the other way around. Now, I am not suggesting that the single person is merely or primarily support staff for their friends with children. What I am saying, though, is that the single life is marked by a capacity for giving oneself to a wide network of friendships beyond a nuclear family. In other words, because I am neither married nor religious, all I have is friendship. And those friendships are the primary affective and salvific context for my life. Which is why I would even go so far as to say that, in Rick's framework of vocation as friendship, single life is the vocation par excellence. Based on our prior conversations in his office, Rick believes, I think, that it is enough simply to call the single person a baptized disciple. In my assessment, this parallels his argument elsewhere that the category of laity, in distinction from clergy, is no longer useful. It's more appropriate to speak of the Christi Fideles, all of the baptized, some of whom are baptized and ordained. I suspect Ed or maybe Sue might talk about this later. But I think it is still important to retain the term single for several reasons. First and most simply, it is a salient sociological and legal category, and so merits theological description. Second, given the Church's position against same-sex marriage, setting aside what you might think about it, it is the vocation or state of life that is mandated for gay and lesbian Catholics. Gay and lesbian Catholics are told they must remain single. More significantly, and this is my third reason, if we don't recognize the single life as a vocation or a life form in the Church with its own theology and spirituality, we just end up back in the old states of life framework that Rick wants to leave behind. The mindset that there are three vocations, marriage, priesthood, religious life, and I simply don't have one. Maybe there isn't necessarily a hierarchy among those three vocations, but they're all better than being single. Finally, and most importantly, by identifying the single life with the fundamental vocation to friendship, we can offer a positive moral and spiritual framework for the single life, regardless of whether that is seen as permanent, pre-marriage, or post-marriage. All vocations are both gifts and tasks. To name the single life as one form of the vocation to friendship enables us to ask what the single life well-lived might look like. How might the single person live out the call to holiness within her various friendships? There is, or there should be, no lack of affectivity or care or fidelity or trust or responsibility or obligation in the single life. There can and should be a breadth of these things. Here, dare I say, I think Pope Francis would agree with me. Francis occasionally makes headlines for saying that single people and couples without children, or, God forbid, with pets but without children, are selfish. And just to be very clear, this is not Rick's position. Also, to be very clear, I think Pope Francis is wrong if he means this as an inherent truth about single or childless people. But I do think he's right to suggest that single people are still called to give of themselves in love. And I think the spirituality of the single life should foster this. I just think that many single people already do this in ways that Francis doesn't recognize. Nevertheless, it would do us and the whole church well to support single people in discerning how they can best live out the call, the universal call, to love, care, and commitment within the concrete circumstances of their life. My hope is that a theology, perhaps even a robust theology of the single life, as the first call to friendship, can serve single people in two ways. First, in addition to resisting the stereotype of single people as excessively independent and selfish, it can also resist the tendency to see the single life as an absence. There is a tendency in the church and in the broader culture to see the single life of a single person as incomplete, as just having not met the right person yet. Rick notes this as the tendency to see singleness as a way station for those not yet married. I think single women in particular absorb this and come to believe that our lives don't really begin until marriage. We're not really adults until those public rites and rituals of the bridal shower, the wedding photos, and the baby shower. This is especially the case for women in the church, where a theology of complementarity teaches women that we are spiritually and ontologically incomplete without men. I believe that articulating the single life as a life of broad friendships and developing a spiritual and moral framework for the single life well lived can lift up the dignity and integrity of single people, women especially, and support their flourishing. Second, for singles who wish to be married but who have not yet found a partner, I've known many of them over the years, and for those who have lost a partner to divorce or death, the framework of friendship may offer a meaningful way of thinking about their lives. Again, the single life need not and should not be an absence of relationships and care. One can continually work on the gift and art of friendship, even if one hopes to someday enter into the sacramental friendship of marriage. I also think seeing the single life as the first vocation to friendship offers two benefits to a theology and spirituality of marriage as well. First, it can provide the basis for the discernment of other possible vocations that Rick hopes for. He is right when he suggests that we do not enter into marriages or religious life from a state of non-relationality, which is typically what single evokes for him in this book. But we do move from a breadth of friendships, that is singleness, to a depth or specificity in a particular friendship. So I would even suggest that getting good at being single, at cultivating friendships of mutuality and care and fidelity and vulnerability, is necessary formation for, but not simply a precursor to, being good at marriage or religious life. For how can one flourish in a vowed form of friendship if they did not first learn the art of friendship prior to these vows? Second, I think renewed attention to friendship in the single life prior to marriage stands to strengthen a marriage when and if the time comes. In A Daring Promise, Rick warns of the cultural tendency to see marriage as the sole source for meeting one's needs. He writes, quote, "All good marriages meet some of our needs some of the time, but no marriage can meet all of our needs all of the time. To the extent that we expect this, we will never be able to cultivate a fruitful lifelong marriage with another." End quote. As sociological studies are showing, the loss or lack of friendships outside one's marriage as one moves through middle age has a notable and detrimental consequences for health and happiness. Single or married, we all need multiple friendships. I think Rick would agree with me here as well. In his book chapter, A School for Love, he describes two icons of married life: the marriage bed and the front porch. The image of the marriage bed obviously indicates the shared vulnerability and intimacy within marriage. But a Christian marriage also requires time spent on the metaphorical front porch, the threshold between home and the larger world. Marriage, he writes, is not meant to be simply a spiritual refuge and oasis from a hostile world. The front porch summons the married couple away from any narcissistic preoccupation with another and toward their obligation to put their marital friendships in the service of others. The particular friendship of marriage must not exclude, and in fact should still actively cultivate, friendship with others. And I want to acknowledge here just how well Rick and Diana model this. In the past couple of years, I have heard Rick speak often with such love and appreciation for his circle of friends, many of whom are also dear colleagues. Many of them are in the room. Rob, Brian, Jeremy, Steve, Boyd. Even the witness of last night's event, we see just how important friendship is to Rick, even as Diana, together with David, Andrew, Brian, and Gregory, remain at the center. And if you've been following his Caring Bridge page recently, you have heard how important his back porch has become. Not the front porch here, but the back porch, as a place to host friends these last several months. Their family is not one that excludes other forms of friendship. Again, I think we need all of these multiple forms of friendship, whether we are married, religious, or single. And I think a clearer articulation of the centrality and breadth of friendship in the single life can serve to offer a meaningful framework for the life of the single person and to complement Rick's theology of marriage. And so to conclude, in the introduction to A Daring Promise, Rick writes, I would hope that single persons and those called to lifelong celibacy might also derive some value from these reflections. I hope I have shown that he has succeeded in this. I have found great value both personally and theologically in his work on vocation and friendship. Frankly, I found A Daring Promise to be quite moving, precisely because it takes marriage off an idealized romantic pedestal and situates it in the daily warp and woof of the imperfect quest for love, vulnerability, and care. It is my hope that Rick sees my reflections on the vocation of the single person as an authentic development of his own thought. And if slight disagreement remains, maybe from 5% to 3%, that is okay with me. As we hear in the Gospel of Luke, a disciple is not above the teacher, but everyone who is fully qualified will be like the teacher. But as Rick himself lifts up in the title of his most recent article on vocation, Jesus, at the end of his own life, reframes his relationships with his students. He no longer calls them disciples or servants, but friends. It has been an immeasurable grace that my own relationship with my teacher has developed into friendship as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elise. That was truly wonderful. Our next speaker is Edward Hannenberg. Ed is the Brain Chair of Catholic Theology and the Chair of the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at John Carroll University in Cleveland, Ohio. Dr. Hannenberg earned his doctorate at the University of Notre Dame, and his research explores 20th century Catholic theology with particular attention to developments in the understanding of church and ministry, the Second Vatican Council, theology of vocation and discernment, and lay ecclesial ministry. A popular speaker, he is a past delegate to the U.S. Lutheran Catholic Dialogue and former theological consultant to the U.S. Bishop Subcommittee on Lay Ministry and its preparation of the document, Co-Workers at the Vineyard of the Lord. Dr. Hannenberg is the author and co-editor of 7 books, including Theodore Hesper, Bridge Builder, Theology for Ministry, an Introduction for Lay Ministers, and what I find to be a true classic, Ministry's Relational Approach, as well as numerous articles in academic and pastoral journals. In 2019, he received the Called and Gifted Award from the Association of Graduate Programs in Ministry in recognition of his contributions to the Church's ministerial life. His paper today is titled The Institution of Ministry, Reordering the Baptismal Priesthood. Please join me in welcoming Ed.
Well, thank you, Kevin, for that introduction. Thank you, Elise, for that really beautiful paper. Dennis, for your remarks this morning, for all the speakers, really. Thanks to all of you for giving up your beautiful Saturday afternoon. There aren't many more of these left, so it's really wonderful that you're here. And thanks especially to Rick for letting this happen, because it's just a wonderful opportunity to reflect on his contribution and just be together. For me too, Rick was never my teacher, but he was a very, very important mentor, one who's become a colleague and a friend. And in fact, the conference we put together, along with Vince Miller and Steve Bevins, in honor of our teacher Tom O'Meara, that's one of my favorite professional memories. It was just a beautiful event, and this is lovely too. The institution of ministry, reordering the baptismal priesthood. On May 10th, 2021, Pope Francis issued motu proprio the apostolic letter Antiochum Magisterium, which established the ministry of catechist as an officially installed lay ministry for the Universal Church. This was preceded in January of that year by a modification of the Code of Canon Law, allowing women to be officially instituted to the ministries of lector and acolyte, lay ministers that had been established in 1972, but that unfortunately and inexplicably had been reserved to men. By December of 2021, a new rite of institution had been issued, along with a long letter from Archbishop Arthur Roach, prefect of the Congregation for Divine Worship, encouraging Episcopal conferences to implement this newly official lay ministry of catechists. Just in August of this year, on the 50th anniversary of Pope Paul VI's move to establish the lay ministries of lector and acolyte, Pope Francis issued a letter affirming his predecessor's decision and repeating an invitation for local churches to propose new instituted ministries, lay ministries, appropriate to their context. The cumulative effect of these recent developments suggests that, with regard to the institution of ministry, something is afoot. Richard Gaillardetz responded to Pope Francis's Antiochum Magisterium and all the brouhaha about catechists in a short essay for the NCR. He began by saying that, quote, many could be forgiven for viewing it with some skepticism as little more than a modest institutional concession within a larger ecclesiological framework that remains thoroughly clericalist and hierarchical. Fair point. In a church order marred by, quote, the toxic sacralization of sacramentally ordained ministries and the unnecessary restrictions that sacralization has encouraged, Rick described this ministerial development as modest. Does it address, quote, the pressing question regarding whether to allow both men and women, married and single, to be considered for all public ministries, including those constituted by sacramental ordination? Rick asked. No, it doesn't, he concludes. And yet, Rick conceded that Antiochum Magisterium moves the ball forward toward a more adequate ecclesiological framework for church ministry. By acknowledging and encouraging official ministries other than the ordained ministries, quote, the Pope appears to move beyond a rigid laity-clergy binary to pursue a vision of the church built up by baptismal charisms and ordered ministries, some of which are established by sacramental ordination and others by ministerial installation. This critique of the lay-clergy binary has been a consistent feature of Rick's work for over 2 decades. It was first spelled out with characteristic clarity in his 1999 article, Shifting Meanings in the Lay-Clergy Distinction. It fueled his pivotal contribution to the Collegeville Ministry Seminar, which culminated in the collective volume Ordering the Baptismal Priesthood, edited by Susan Wood. It can be found in the consensus statement of the Boston College Seminar on the Future of Priesthood. It made its way into countless presentations Rick has given to bishops, priests, deacons, religious, and lay ministers. It can be found in his critical commentaries on the documents of Vatican II and in his own constructive ecclesiological contributions. My read on Rick's critique of the lay-clergy distinction is that for Rick, the problem is not that there is a distinction between the ordained and the non-ordained, but that this is the only distinction. The problem is that ministerial diversity is reduced to a binary, and the fact that this binary is based on a misconstrual of ministerial power. That's what drives the theological critique. More positively, what grounds Rick's alternative vision of ministerial diversity is a relational theology of ministry, in which service in and on behalf of the church is not split between ordained ministry and lay ministry, but rather where service is construed as a variety of ordered ministries, some ordained, some instituted, some commissioned, all rooted in baptism, recognized in individual charisms, supported through appropriate formation, and ordered through liturgical ritual. I've been learning from ministry, I've been learning from Rick about ministry for almost 30 years. The very first thing I read was a 1999 worship article in Service of Communion, the Trinitarian Foundation for Christian Ministry, which inspired me then to develop my own Trinitarian relational approach. The most recent thing I read was his 2022 Theological Studies article, The Chimera of a Deinstitutionalized Church, Social Structure Analysis as a Path to Institutional Church Reform, which inspires me now to look again at the institution of ministry. So what I'd like to do in this paper is focus on two of Rick's earlier insights, which are genuine contributions to the theology of ministry: the notion of ecclesial repositioning and his treatment of ministerial power. I'd like to develop these insights along the lines that Rick himself recommends in his most recent Theological Studies article. In that article, Rick challenges ecclesiologists to engage sociology more deliberately and more directly. In what follows, I accept that challenge. By adopting the particular sociological approach he recommends, namely the critical realist school of social analysis, in the hope of helping him help the church imagine a ministerial order beyond the lay clergy divide. So first, ecclesial repositioning. The phrase ecclesial repositioning appears in Rick's work for the first time in his 1999 essay, Shifting Meanings in the Lay Clergy Distinction. There, as Rick begins to sketch out a new theological foundation for ministry, a foundation not premised on the lay clergy distinction, he suggests starting with the fundamental ministeriality of the church. But within this fundamental ministeriality, a question arises. If ministry pervades the whole community, what distinguishes those ministries which demand formal recognition? To this question, Rick reflects, and here I quote at length. Clearly, there are certain ministries in the church which, because of their public nature, bring about a certain ecclesial repositioning or reconfiguration. In other words, the person who takes on such a ministry finds themselves in a new relationship within the church, and the assumption is that they will be empowered by the Spirit in a manner commensurate with their new ministerial relationship. These ministers are public persons who in some sense are both called by the community and accountable to the community. The public nature of their ministry is evident in the way in which we tend to hold such ministers to a higher moral standard. We recognize the possibility that their moral failings, because of their public character, might be a cause for scandal. Here I have in mind not just the ordained ministries, but, for example, the director of Christian formation mentioned earlier. This lay minister is called by the community, based on a recognized charism, to take a new public role in the church. She's called to enter into a new ministerial relationship within the community. This new ministerial relationship may or may not be ritualized, but the repositioning is clear and obvious to those active in her community. Moreover, to the extent that this new ecclesial relationship brings with it new ministerial responsibilities, we would expect her to be empowered by the Spirit in the performance of these new ministries. End quote. If the lay clergy divide rests on a substance ontology that sees ordination as effecting an ontological change in the individual, abstracted from any relational existence, Rick's alternative is not to reject ontology, Rather, what is needed is a relational ontology, in which attention is drawn not to the isolated individual, but to the person in relation. In keeping with traditional Catholic theological reflection, Rick continues, we can affirm the ontological effects of sacramental ordination. However, any such ontological change is grounded not in the conferral of powers on an individual, but on the reconfiguration of the person into a new ecclesial relation. These lines resonate with the recovery of ontology in the critical realist school of social analysis, which Rick engages in his recent essay. There, Rick argues that Vatican II's notion of the Church as sacrament, a complex reality, both human and divine, encourages ecclesiologists to draw on the insights of sociologists in order to better understand the Church's human reality. However, against neo-scholasticism's two-tiered superstructure of nature and grace, Rick observes, quote, "The task of ecclesiology is not to superimpose the knowledge of revelation on top of social scientific inquiry, but to critically apprehend with the eyes of faith the fruit of human inquiry as itself emerging from within a horizon of revelation and grace." But to critically apprehend with the eyes of faith the fruit of human inquiry as itself emerging from within a horizon of revelation and grace. It was actually a philosopher of science, Roy Bhaskar, who launched critical realism with his critique of the rigid empiricism that he sees reigning over the philosophy of science since David Hume, a view that reduces what is real to what is empirically verifiable by our five senses. The claim that there is nothing ontologically real that exists beyond the empirical is belied, Bhaskar notes, by what scientists actually do in the lab, striving as they do to explain events by studying the often invisible forces that cause them. It is not the law of gravity, Bhaskar argues, that causes the apple to fall to the ground, but the relationship between the apple and the earth, and the force, not the law, of gravity, which that relationship generates. This force is a transfactual. It cannot be perceived by our senses, but it is nevertheless quite real, ontologically real. This commitment to ontology can be seen in the critical realist conception of emergence. Critical realists hold that there are complex entities that exist as a result of the coming together of two or more lower level entities. The higher level entity is ontologically real, possessing emergent properties that differ from those of its constituent parts. Water is made up of hydrogen and oxygen, but water has an ontological reality with characteristics quite different from either of these parts taken separately. Water's ability to put out fire, in contrast to hydrogen or oxygen's tendency to fuel fire, is an emergent property, defined as a property that is not possessed by any of the parts individually, and that would not be possessed by the full set of parts in the absence of a structuring set of relations between them. With emergence, something genuinely different and genuinely real comes into existence when certain things come together in certain ways. And it's not just a collection of parts that create something new, but the particular relations among these parts that lead to emergence. This idea of emergence proves to be an enormously productive idea for sociologists like Margaret Archer, Dave Vos, Douglas Purpura, Christian Smith, and others who claim the critical realist mantle. Something genuinely real comes into existence when people come together. And this something, either culture or social structures, has an ontological density and calls a power that does not displace the agency of these individuals, but that can't simply be reduced to the sum total of their actions. Margaret Archer frames the theory as a way to overcome both methodological individualism and methodological collectivism. Contrary to reductionist accounts that at one end seek to explain society exclusively in terms of human action, or, at the other end, to explain human behavior exclusively in terms of social conditioning, Critical realism holds up agency, structure, and culture as three irreducibly distinct realities. In distinguishing these three, not just epistemologically, but ontologically, critical realism also offers a way to explain how they relate. And it is precisely critical realism's ability to explain the relationship between social structures and, to a lesser extent, culture on the one hand, and human agency on the other. It's precisely that explanation that has appealed to Catholic ethicists, who apply these categories to structural sin and moral agency in helpful ways. And here I'm thinking particularly preeminently of Dan Finn, but also David Hilliard, Dan Daly, Theodore Hoskley, and Matthew Shadle, all of whom have explicitly embraced critical realist theory in their own social ethic. Which is not to say that these are the only Catholic ethicists engaging in social theory around the room. I mean, Kenneth Hines, Kristen Meyer, Christine Rudolph, Ada Maria Diaz, Gerald Beyer, Katie Grimes, Christina Traina, to name just a few, have engaged social theory in different and constructive ways. Here we're doing ecclesiology, not ethics. And in this context, that of ecclesiology, I'd like to focus on social structure and bring that into dialogue with Rick's notion of ecclesial reposition. Critical realists like to quote Douglas Porpora's 1989 definition that social structures are, quote, systems of relations among social positions. A definition he later refined as material relations among social positions and social constructs. I like Dan Daly's paraphrase. A social structure consists of webs of relations among pre-existing social positions. The important thing to note is that the relations that constitute a structure are not between individual persons, but between social positions. In developing the notion of social position, Vaskar reflects, well, we need a system of mediating concepts, designating the slots, as it were, in the actual structure into which active subjects must slip in order to reproduce it. That is a system of concepts designating the point of contact between human agency and social structures. This point of contact is the social position. The social position, then, becomes the basic building block of the social structure, which consists of the web of relations among these positions. Applied to the Church, we would say that the Vatican, the diocese, the parish, the pastoral staff, these are all social structures consisting of social positions, and these positions always exist in relation to one another, even if the individuals occupying these positions do not. So when Gaillardet talks about ecclesial repositioning, from a critical realist perspective, he's talking about an individual stepping into a pre-existing slot. When he says that this applies not only to the ordained, but also to the director of religious education, he is presupposing the prior emergence of a social position, namely the position of director of religious education, that is part of a social, we would say, ecclesial structure. Such ecclesial structures are ontologically real, existing as webs of relations among ecclesial positions. These webs of relations are made by individuals, but not of individuals, through a process we might call ministerial ordering. With its understanding of social structure as an emergent reality, critical realism offers an explanatory framework and a historically nuanced way of describing the process of ministerial ordering. How do we get to the place where an individual could step into the role of director of religious education, or the instituted ministry of catechist, and thus take on a new ministerial position within the community? Well, it's complicated, because emergence is not a monocausal event. The ordering of ministry cannot be reduced to an action of the Pope or the brilliant idea of a theologian. Quoting Daly, individual persons assume social positions and relate to other social positions in characteristic ways by practicing the normative actions of the position. When, over time, such relations draw others in and are supported by material conditions, cognitive categories, and normative claims, a social structure emerges. But this dynamic is not only one of reinforcement or reiteration, it can also lead to change. As Porpora puts it, social structures consist of human relations in the midst of actors that connects them to each other and to social things. As actors twist and turn and otherwise act within the structures that bind them, they modify those structures. We thus arrive at what Archer has called the morphogenetic approach to agency and structure. The morphogenetic dynamic is what Rick draws our attention to in his essay on institutional church reform. Since the process of reform is his interest in that essay, his focus is on how agents influence structures. But structures also influence agents. This brings us to the question of ministerial empowerment. As I said earlier, it seems to me that Rick's problem with the lay-clergy distinction is twofold. First, it reduces ministerial diversity to a binary. Second, it builds that binary on an individualist account of sacred power. Power, which Rick defines as the capacity to engage in effective action in service of the church's life and mission, is not a bad thing in and of itself. In fact, it is essential to the proper functioning of any social reality, including the church. The question is, how is this power exercised? But the question is also, how is this power construed? Rick proposes a relational understanding of ministerial empowerment, arguing for reversal of the way in which it is often presented. Speaking of ordination, he writes, "But it is not the conferral of power that makes the ordained minister. Rather, it is the reconfiguration of the person into a new ministerial relationship that requires that empowerment by the Holy Spirit necessary for the fulfillment of that ministry." But how exactly does that work? Critical realists think they have a better explanation than most. On the question of how structure and agency relate, Margaret Archer critiques those sociological approaches that purport a kind of determinism, in which social structures seem to move people like the hydraulics of a machine, one of her favorite images. Douglas Porpora has his own metaphor. He accuses much contemporary sociology of imagining human beings as zombies, acting only in a kind of hypnotized responsiveness to societal stimuli. Archer, Porpora, and other critical realists want to affirm the causal power of social structures on people without eliminating their freedom as agents. For Archer, the solution is to recognize that the causal power of social structures flows through human relations to direct human action. It is the relations among social positions, which constitute a given social structure, that create certain restrictions, enablements, incentives, and disincentives that influence the individual agents operating within a given social structure. Agents are free, but they are always already contextualized within various social structures and cultures. These structures and cultures cause the individual to act in certain ways, but only because the individual makes decisions in light of these incentives and disincentives. These restrictions, enablements, incentives, and disincentives are built into the relationships among social positions, but they always pass through the person in a process that Margaret Archer calls the internal conversation, that I would call discernment. Structures have a causal impact, but only through the exercise of individual agency. People in certain positions are empowered to do certain things, which doesn't mean they always choose to do them. Likewise, certain people in certain positions are disempowered from doing certain things, which doesn't mean they don't try. Thus, in the case of ministerial repositioning, it is the repositioning itself that is the empowerment. For the relationships among ecclesial positions are already carry with them the restrictions, enablements, incentives, and disincentives that empower the minister to engage in effective action in service of the church's life and mission. Now for the most important part. So far I have been moving within the realm of nature. We have not yet entered the realm of grace. The language of critical realists, transfactuals, emergent properties, ontologically real entities that we cannot see, these are categories for understanding the natural world, not the supernatural. But when it comes to ministerial empowerment, we're talking about something more. On this, Rick is pretty clear. Through repositioning, the assumption is that ministers will be empowered by the Holy Spirit in a manner commensurate with their new ministerial relationship. I want to take this insight to the next level, but without resorting to the two-tier superstructure of nature and grace. Rick rejects a notion of sacred power grounded in a substance ontology and imagined as a personal possession of the ordained. One of the hallmarks of such a substance ontology in the realm of ministry has been an emphasis on the sacramental character, bestowed as an indelible mark on the soul of the ordained. Over the centuries, the idea of a special mark on the soul of the priest served to separate the minister from the community, setting him apart as ontologically different from the non-ordained. What if we imagine a sacramental character not along the lines of an invisible mark on the individual soul, but as the theological name for the ontological reality that is ministerial order? What if we conceived of the sacramental character, which goes along not only with ordination, but also with baptism and confirmation? What if we conceived of this not individualistically, but relationally? To suggest a more relational approach to the sacramental character is not particularly new. Rick, Susan, and I have been talking about it for years, and long before us, Matthias Stephen drew attention to the fundamentally ecclesial nature of the sacramental character, an insight that was famously developed by Edward Ecclesiology and Karl Rahner. Ecclesiology, for example, highlighted the fact that scholastic and neo-scholastic theologians associated the sacramental character with the sacramentum et res, the sign and the reality, a category of medieval sacramental theology that evolved as a kind of a middle term between the sacramental sign, the sacramentum tantum, and the final effect of grace, the res tantum. Drawing on this trio of terms, Ecclesiology argued that each sacrament, sacramentum, has a double effect. One in relation to the visible church, that's the sacramentum et res, and the other in relationship to Christ and to God. That's the religious effect, grace, the res. Moreover, according to good scholastic theology, these effects are related in such a way that the former is a sacrament of the latter. This really evolved in the context of Eucharistic theology. So you have the bread and wine, sacramentum, become the body and blood, the sacramentum et res, which makes possible the res, or union with Christ in grace. Things move, if you will, from the sacramentum to the sacrament res to the res. In the sacraments of baptism, confirmation, and order, God does not work through an individual imprint on the soul. God works through the person's place or position within the ecclesial community. This ecclesial position flows from the rites of baptism, confirmation, and ordination, and leads to the sacramental grace or empowerment that comes from this position. In other words, it is the ecclesial relational understanding of the sacramentum et res that allows us to reconceive the sacramental character as a fundamentally ecclesial relational reality. We do not have to imagine the character as a mysterious, indelible mark on the individual soul. Rather, we can imagine it as a fundamentally, always already graced, social structure. This is a ministerial order that is as ontologically real as any mark on the soul, with real causal power in the life and work of the ministerial agent. This objective ecclesial reality works through the subjective freedom of the minister, not only on the level of nature, but also within the realm of grace. conclusion. In following Rick's example by engaging critical realism, I'm not suggesting this is the only way for ecclesiologists to engage the social sciences. I'm not trying to subordinate the truths of revelation to the deliberations of reason, nor am I simply setting the two alongside one another. What I'm trying to do is what Rick recommends, namely, critically apprehend, with the eyes of faith, the fruit of human inquiry as itself emerging from within a horizon of revelation and grace. To associate the sacramental character with ministerial order, broadly conceived as a grace social structure, raises questions that are not easily resolved, particularly when it comes to the relationship between those repositionings that involve sacramental ordination and those that do not. If we take seriously, however, what is happening at the sociological level when a catechist is officially installed, and if we assume that God is at work empowering this lay minister through the same social processes that would apply for any social position, then don't we have to say that the grace effect of this repositioning is different only in degree and not different in kind from that of sacramental ordination? This line of thinking calls for a reconsideration of all those sacraments that carry character with them, baptism, confirmation, and ordination, perhaps helpfully pushing us past the lay clergy binary toward a more integrated understanding of these sacraments as part of the shared ordering of a church that is missionary and thus ministerial by its very nature. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ed. Our last speaker on this panel is J.C. Joseph. J.C. is Assistant Professor of Ecclesiology and Theology of Ministry at Villanova University. Dr. Joseph earned her PhD in systematic theology from Boston College, with interest primarily in ecclesiology and theological anthropology. Her main areas of research involve understandings of unity and difference in the Catholic Church, how these definitions have shifted over the centuries, and how erroneous expressions have wounded the bonds of communion between different peoples. She notes that these differences are not only intercultural and ecumenical, but also involve the almost invisible ancient Eastern Catholic churches that have been present since the first centuries in North Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, and Eastern Europe. Dr. Joseph is also committed to understanding how globalization and migration have brought all of these differences to the United States in the past 50 years, and how these diasporas influence understandings of Catholicity for the Church of the third millennium. Aside from the academy, she is very involved in the lay ministry of the Syro-Malabar Catholic Diocese of Chicago, which spans across the United States to unite nearly 40 parishes and 40 missions. Her primary concern is to work with the emerging second generation of this immigrant community, particularly regarding issues of identity, domestic violence, and intergenerational healing. Her paper today is Vatican II and the Mimetic Insights of Richard Gaillardetz Non-Competitive Ecclesiology. Please join me in welcoming J.C.
Thank you, Kevin. And I just want to say thank you to everyone for this opportunity to express my deep gratitude to Rick and to share these ideas with you all. So Vatican II and the Mimetic Insights of Richard Gaillardetz Non-Competitive Ecclesiology. Richard Gaillardet's lecture last night helped us to reflect on the paradox of the Church's sacramentality. In the wake of the clerical sex abuse crisis, increased polarization, and the experience of exclusion felt by many, how is the Church, as Lumen Gentium 1 puts it, a sign and instrument both of a very close-knit union with God and of the unity of the whole human race? How does this gap between concrete reality and the ideal vision remain a paradox and not actually reveal a contradiction or even a delusion? Gaillardetz has spent much of his theological career exploring the promise of the Second Vatican Council and has inspired a new generation of theologians to see how the Church, amidst its brokenness, is still a sacramental sign that continues to point to Christ. In his book, An Unfinished Council, Vatican II, Pope Francis, and the Renewal of Catholicism, Gaillardetz urges theologians to build on the diligent work of commentaries and focused exegesis of conciliar texts to provide a synthetic vision of the Council that he says, quote, draws together the Council's many contributions into a more coherent theological vision of the Church, one capable of underwriting a comprehensive program of ecclesial reform and renewal." End quote. He himself contributes to this constructive theological task by proposing a non-competitive theology of the Church, which we've heard referenced throughout the day. Borrowing the term non-competitive from Protestant theologian Catherine Tanner, Gaillardet pursues, quote, "the possibility that Vatican II consistently transposed oppositional ecclesial relationships, for example, the papacy and the episcopacy, into non-competitive ecclesial relationships, largely by way of its recovery of theology of the Holy Spirit." Ormond Rush, in his book, The Vision of Vatican II, Fundamental Principles, demonstrates the significance of this approach by using Gaillardet's non-competitive vision as one of the main organizing principles for various sets of relationships that constitute the Church, both ad intra and ad extra. Agreeing with the value of this approach, my paper advances Gaillardet's synthetic vision of the Council by first asking what might be gained if his dialogue with Tanner's non-competitive theology were replaced with James Allison's mimetic understanding of non-rivalry. My intuition is that the latter term compels a recognition of one's complicity and the necessity for conversion in a manner that is absent from the former. The second part of my paper explores the presence of these mimetic insights into two relationships that appear throughout Gaillardet's work. One, the Magisterium and the Christian faithful, and two, unity and diversity in a global church. Finally, my paper will explore how this synthetic ecclesiological vision relates to the current publication of the U.S. National Synthesis as part of the worldwide synodal process. So part one, the mimetic understanding of non-rivalry. Both Catherine Tanner's non-competitive theology and James Allison's mimetic non-rivalry are rooted in an ontology of grace. In her book, Economy of Grace, Tanner contrasts the theological economy rooted in non-competitiveness and non-exclusion with contemporary capitalistic economies rooted in what she calls the sinful principles of competition and private property. As Gaillardet notes, Tanner's theology is, quote, "grounded in God's unmerited gift of God's self to us. This grace never becomes our private possession, but is received and shared in gratitude. Since grace is not a commodity to be measured, it cannot be the basis for a competitive relationship among creatures. Christians are to live in imitation of the divine gift-giving in which God, in giving away God's very self, does not become any less God. God's giving does not create lack within God, because what is given transcends quantification. So too we, God's creatures, acknowledging our own giftedness, are to imitate God's gift-giving and our relations with one another. What we give to and for one another is also beyond quantification, and therefore does not contribute any lack or debt of the kind that would require commensurable exchange." End quote. So Gaillardet is correct in adapting Tanner's insight that the intended distinctiveness of ecclesial relationships is that they are rooted in a logic of abundance and gratuitousness, rather than a logic of scarcity and reciprocity. The issue, however, is how do we get beyond the assertion of this ideal? How do we inspire a deeper conversion that overcomes the zero-sum relations that ignore the presence of grace at the core of all of our ecclesial relationships? James Allison would respond that this competitive or rivalrous orientation to the other is rooted not in values adopted from capitalism, but in our very constitution as human persons. In his book, Knowing Jesus, he argues that through what he coins the intelligence of the victim, found in Jesus' teachings on moral issues, discipleship, and the coming reign of God, Jesus sought to reveal how, quote, our programming forms us in rivalry and the techniques of survival by exclusion. Yet, Allison continues, Jesus is determined to teach people at the level the law cannot reach. How to be free from being bound to the other by violence. Allison demonstrates the full meaning of this intelligence of the victim by examining the impact of the resurrection on the disciples. Prior to Good Friday, they had left everything behind for 3 years to follow Jesus, convinced that he was the Messiah that would liberate their people from Roman oppression. As soon as it became clear, however, that this path led to crucifixion, most of them abandoned Jesus and scattered out of fear, severing any possibility of further relationship. Yet, according to Allison, when the disciples encountered the crucified and risen Jesus, it was not experienced as vengeance from beyond the tomb for their complicity in his abandonment, but as forgiveness. The disciples understood their capacity to turn against their own, while simultaneously experiencing the mercy of being granted a second chance at right relationship. In his analysis of Allison's body of work, Grant Kaplan sees an ecclesiological upside to this being forgiven. By receiving this gratuity specifically as forgiveness, the disciples recognize how they had been living according to the sinful logics of scarcity and reciprocity, leading to the rivalrous consequences of surviving over against one another, rather than knowing that their stability and security can only come from God. This act of divine reconciliation challenged how they formed their sense of belonging, no longer being able to justify the mechanisms of exclusion that formed temporary unities against another. To be known by Jesus in this intimate and graced experience of being forgiven leads to an interior conversion by which, as Allison argues, quote, he or she will always belong critically to all other groups, because all other groups derive their unity over against someone or some other group. The only unity to which he or she cannot escape belonging is the new unity of humanity that the Holy Spirit creates out of the risen victim, the unity which subverts all other unities. Kaplan develops a tentative mimetic ecclesiology on this Allisonian premise by arguing that just as the Eucharist, the source and summit of Christian life, is a sacrifice that undoes sacrifice, so the Church is a community that radically reorients community, end quote. The Church, he further argues, is an induction into a new pattern of being and belonging by which one slowly unlearns their false programming. This new way of being and belonging is rooted in the universality or Catholicity of the Church, through which there can be no over against on account of grace, as forgiveness given to all. Yet even as we are inducted into this promise through baptism, we must constantly unlearn and resist the temptation to exclusion by finding our security that finds its security in claims to superiority. This call to constant conversion happens through the practice of Eucharistic abiding. The Eucharist, Kaplan argues, pulls us out of a force field of romantic self-regard and into a remembering of our being forgiven by the innocent victim. It is only by abiding that we can experience the slow process of coming to understand how we are caught up in unhealthy being and belonging. How we are not only victims of harm, but are capable, always, perpetuating harm as well. This constant, slow unlearning finds resonance in Gaillardet's work, through which he argues that, quote, the Church must become a school of discipleship, in which dominating power and a preoccupation with control are transformed into the power of reconciliation. Through this account of non-rivalry as the basis for a tentative mimetic ecclesiology, we are given tools to further advance Gaillardet's synthetic vision of the Second Vatican Council, by which the Church might better adhere to St. Paul's reminder that God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ, has given us the ministry of reconciliation. 1 Corinthians 5:18. First, we will consider two ecclesial relationships that have moved from opposition to the possibility of reconciled existence, before examining how the Francis papacy has been implementing this more synthetic vision through the call to synodality. Part 2, ecclesial relationships through the lens of mimetic non-rivalry. In his public lecture at St. John's University in 2015, Gaillardet noted that, quote, one of the problems that have haunted Catholic ecclesiology, certainly after Trent, is that key ecclesial relationships have suffered by being understood within hierarchical economies within the church that are based on inequitable power relations. First, we must criticize the dominance of a more juridical approach to church relationships, and the antidote is a more robust, non-competitive understanding of the church. Given our brief excursus on Allison's understanding of non-rivalry and gratuity as forgiveness, I want to reflect on two ecclesial relationships that appear throughout Gaillardet's work and contribute to a synthetic vision of the Second Vatican Council. One, the Magisterium of the Christian faithful, and two, unity and diversity in a global church. Gaillardet begins his analysis of the ecclesial relationship between the Magisterium and the Christian faithful with a passage from Pope Pius X's 1906 encyclical, which described the church as an unequal society, comprised of the clergy and the laity. Rooted in a propositional understanding of divine revelation that could be mastered by the clergy alone, the laity were expected to passively receive and obey magisterial teaching. Any claim, Gaillardet further notes, that the faithful or theologians would have their own access to those truths would compromise the distinctive claims of the magisterium. Such fears more closely align with the logic of domination that is more concerned with control than with the subversion of worldly power enacted in the humble washing of the feet. The Second Vatican Council, however, begins the process of undoing this exclusionary logic of clerical control and lay docility in two ways. First, as has been mentioned, in De Verbum, the Council provides a renewed theology of revelation that, as Gaillardet notes, quote, comes to us as an invitation into relationship. The Father addresses us not by way of text or proposition, but as a divine person, Jesus Christ, who is both the mediator and sum total of revelation, De Verbum 2. Elsewhere, he argues that the knowledge of God that has been revealed to us in Christ is the kind of knowledge gained in personal relationship. It is precisely the revelatory nature of this invitation into right relationship with the crucified and risen Jesus, a revelation of who we are and how we belong to one another in light of gratuity as forgiveness, that both Allison and Kaplan try to make clear in their mimetic ecclesiology. Furthermore, this invitation places the whole church, not just the laity, in the posture of personal receptivity and response to divine initiative. The second way that the Council, according to Gaillardet's synthetic vision, undoes the exclusionary logic of clerical superiority and lay inferiority is through the teaching of the sensus fidei, which Gaillardet defines as a supernatural instinct for the faith through which the people of God adhere unwaveringly to the faith. The shared responsibility for the tradition, or the handing on of the faith, is clear in Gaudium et Spes 44, which states that, quote, with the help of the Holy Spirit, it is the task of the whole people of God, particularly of its pastors and theologians, to listen to and distinguish the many voices of our times, and to interpret them in light of God's word, in order that the revealed truth may be more deeply penetrated, better understood, and more suitably presented. Because it is the same Holy Spirit that is at work in both the Magisterium and the whole people of God, the contributions of all must be discerned for the proper building up of the church. This perspective becomes clearer through the Council's respect for both church office and baptismal charisms. Lumen Gentium 4 recognizes how the Holy Spirit guides the church in the way of all truth, and uniting it in fellowship and ministry bestows upon it different hierarchic and charismatic gifts. Again, Gaillardet argues, any rivalry between these gifts is transcended by their mutual dependence on the power of the Holy Spirit in the life of the church. Rather than compete with the charismatic gifts expressed by the faithful, the ordained are called to recognize, empower, and nurture the gifts in those they pastor for the good of the whole. In addition to the ecclesial relationship between the Magisterium and the Christian faithful, I also want to consider Gaillardet's work on the relationship between unity and diversity within the global church. In his book, Ecclesiology for a Global Church, he notes how in service to a Western conquest paradigm that distorted understandings of Christian mission, typical accounts of Christian historiography have, quote, often imposed an artificial unity on world Christianity, with the unfortunate consequence of masking the character of early Christianity as a diverse global movement. Despite an understanding that the origins of Christianity stretch far beyond the Greco-Roman Empire, to include churches in Ethiopia, Syria, Persia, Armenia, and India, Pope Benedict XVI made a bold claim in his Regensburg address that, quote, given this convergence between biblical faith and Greek philosophical inquiry, Christianity, despite its origins and some significant developments in the East, finally took on its historically decisive character in Europe. This Eurocentric prioritization of Hellenistic Christianity reflects an unnecessary tribalism of Western superiority that undermines the Catholicity of the Church, as having no over-against in light of divine gratuity. Gaillardet contests this tribalistic bias by drawing on Lamin Sanneh's book, Whose Religion is Christianity? This provocative title encourages reflection on whether any one group or culture can possess this way of life that is meant to undo binaries of us versus them. For Sanneh, the very fact that the New Testament was not written in Aramaic, the language of Jesus, reveals that Christianity has always been a translated religion, whose revelatory character, as mentioned above, is not based on a text, but rather from the communal encounter with Jesus of Nazareth. Because, as Gaillardet argues, translation becomes an apt metaphor for the Church's Catholicity, it undoes any binary of superiority or inferiority by placing God at the center of all cultures. No culture is so superior that it has exclusive access to God's invitation, and no culture is so inferior that it can be excluded. Gaillardet further argues that the universal faith of the Church abides not as some transcultural reality that is imposed on other cultures, but rather is discovered through discernment in the dialogical space between. From these two examples of ecclesial relationships alone, of the Magisterium and the whole Christian faithful, and of unity and diversity in the global Church, we can see how the Council's desire, as Orman Rush notes, to hold two terms, two groups, or roles in a dynamic tension preserves the values of both sides, while allowing one to correct the other from becoming an absolute. Other fruitful tensions that have been explored by both Gaillardet and Rush include the Christological and pneumatological, particular universal, Catholic ecumenical, church, world, etc. In each of these examples, we can imagine how Gaillardet's non-competitive ecclesiology, advanced through the insights of mimetic ecclesiology, can challenge a new generation of Catholics to both understand and receive a more synthetic vision of the Council. Part 3, Synodality and Non-Rivalry. Such understanding of this vision, of course, is not simply attained through a study of the Council, but through an experiential and relational participation in ecclesial conversion, from habits of rivalry to those of reconciliation, from experiences of humiliation to those of healing. For nearly a decade, Pope Francis has slowly been preparing the global Church for a fresh reception of the Council, by which this ecclesial conversion might be possible. At the end of his book, An Unfinished Council, Gaillardet summarizes a few aspects of the Francis papacy that have in some ways anticipated the current invitation to the whole people of God to participate in the Synod on Synodality. In particular, Gaillardet argues, in Evangelii Gaudium, we come to, quote, the end of a de facto 50-year papal moratorium on the Council's teaching on the sense of the faithful. In paragraph 119 of this encyclical, Francis states that the presence of the Spirit gives Christians a certain co-naturality of divine realities, and a wisdom which enables them to grasp those realities intuitively, even when they lack the wherewithal to give them precise expression. The U.S. National Synthesis Report, which was published on Monday of this week before being sent to Rome, reveals these very implicit intuitions to which we as theologians must become attentive. Amidst the characterization of numerous wounds, we can hear in the sensus fidei of this country that there is a supernatural instinct that the church is not meant to mimic the binary polarizations of wider society. The church is meant to transform them. As one of the 700,000 participants put it, quote, divisive political ideologies present in our society have seeped into all aspects of our lives. Another participant echoed this sentiment by expressing that, quote, people at both ends of the political spectrum have set up camp opposing the others, forgetting that they are one in the body of Christ. Partisan politics is infiltrating homilies and ministry, and this trend has created division and intimidation among believers. The pain of these wounds go further, as the synodal synthesis names how the sin and crime of sexual abuse has eroded not only trust in the hierarchy and the moral integrity of the church, but also created a culture of fear that keeps people from entering into relationship with one another, and thus from experiencing the sense of belonging and connectedness for which they yearn. In addition to these wounds, the report also expressed the pain of exclusion felt by LGBTQ Catholics and Catholics of color, and also the exclusion of women in decision-making processes in the church. The capacity to listen and to be present to these cries of pain is important. It is the next step, however, which must be done with careful discernment to live into the promise of the church as a sign and instrument of unity. To exist with this pain that wounds the body of Christ and resist the urge to secure one's own place by pointing a finger at another is a challenge of living into the non-rivalrous promise by which the church can become a seed of the reign of God. It would be easy, for example, in a room full of lay Catholic theologians, to form a quick unity over against the entire hierarchy as untrustworthy in the wake of the abuse crisis. It would be easy to scapegoat a member of the opposite political spectrum as misunderstanding the full demands of the gospel. The hard work of ecclesial conversion, however, is to stay present to the wound itself, with all of its discomfort, like Thomas the Apostle before the wounds of Christ. The wounds that mar Christ's body are indeed grotesque and hard to look at. They remind us of our brokenness and our limitations, but they can become glorified if we work through these wounds with the Holy Spirit and the conviction that we are a people baptized not only into the crucifixion, but also of the resurrection. Only with this conviction can the church become a school of discipleship, which undoes our rivalrous programming at the level that the law cannot reach. Conclusion. So in this paper, I've tried to place what I see as complementary insights in Gaillardet's non-competitive ecclesiology with James Allison's implicit mimetic ecclesiology. Not simply as an intellectual exercise, but because of its promise to respond to a very real cry in our church for another way. The faithful express a true desire to be and to belong to the church in a manner that does not simply mimic other clubs or associations, but is lived out in an authentic joy of the gospel. It is a task of theologians, and ecclesiologists in particular, to help orient this desire to the ecclesial habits that form us into greater depths of interior conversion and communal reconciliation. It is my conviction that Richard Gaillardet's work, particularly on the Second Vatican Council, has equipped us precisely for this moment, and for that we owe him our deepest gratitude. Thank you.
So we have about 10-15 minutes for discussion, questions, comments. I believe there may be a road floating mic. No, if not, yes, there is. So yeah, feel free to raise your hand and introduce yourself. Yeah, in the back.
David Hunter from the Department of Theology. This is a comment and a question for Elise Raby. Just wanted to say I found your presentation completely convincing, even the 5% that you cited from Professor Gaillardetz. But my question is, you seem not to make a strong distinction between the three forms of the single life, that is, single life freely chosen intentionally, and single life as a result of divorce or death, or single life just waiting to get married. And I guess my question was, isn't it important to emphasize the single life freely chosen, intentionally chosen? Simply because if not, it seems to lose its distinctiveness as a response, as a form of vocation. If there isn't the element of intentionality in free choice.
Do you mean as opposed to like a single life involuntarily chosen? You just, I wish I weren't single, but I am?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I think, Jana Bennett has done some really interesting work. She's a theologian who is herself married with children, but has a book that came out relatively recently on the theology of the single life. And her whole first chapter is on this question of choice, and to what degree one does choose the single life. And I think what's helpful about her framework is that she points out that much of our life, the language of freedom or choice, is always kind of tied up in the concrete circumstances of where we happen to be, the relationships, the networks that we happen to be in. And so people, hopefully married by choice, that is something that you were asked by the priest as you stand at the altar, not here freely and voluntarily. But there's also some way in which the circumstances of your life kind of brought you to a person and you said, yeah, let's kind of make this work together. And I think I find that the single life is in some ways analogous to that, that there is a way in which people can be freely choosing to be single. Some people, again, are not. They would rather be in a relationship or married. But I think the sense in which, for single people, for people in religious life, for married people, your choice is always still just sort of informed by the life that you have led up to that point and what your particular context is. I think there are of course some like lived differences between the single life intentionally chosen and the single life not. Even just as simple as like, is someone actively dating? Are they trying to find someone? But I think the commonality there is that regardless of what the commonality is friendship. Even if you are seeking a relationship, typically marital relationships have to grow out of a deep friendship. And so I think it's helpful to say, even if there is a distinction between freely choosing the single life or not, we can all be working on those friendships with our other single friends, with married friends. So I think there's more in common there than perhaps that divides.
Kathy.
Thank you. Kathy Clifford. My question is also on the same line, Elise, and I just wondered, in listening to you, and I want to thank you for a thoughtful and provocative paper. I would just begin by observing that in Canada today, about 1 in 4 adults is single. And this is not valued and recognized in our society, nor in our churches, when we hear the activity for parish communities to support couples and for families, for young people and youth and for the elderly, but very often for young single people, or some of us middle-aged and older, we're just like the forgotten folks. And I wonder if that's a reflection of the fact that what we would classically call the general vocation of the baptized faithful is not recognized by a liturgical action, as is ordained ministries, or the sacrament of marriage, or the liturgies and celebrations of religious profession.
Yeah, I would agree with you on that. First, especially that single people are invisible and forgotten in parish contexts. I think that has become visible to me in the last 15 years or so in 2 key moments. First, if any of you here work in parishes or have worked in parishes, if you ask a pastor or a director of religious education, how big is your parish? They say, we are 400 families. And I've heard read that and I have thought, I don't know if I literally count. I literally don't know if I am one of those 400 because I don't constitute a nuclear family, or even, you know, I don't have a child. And I think what it is intended to do is to give a sense of how many kids do we need in CCD, how many catechists do we need to pull out of the woodwork. But the other moment is at the sign of peace. I would invite you next time you're at Mass to look and see what happens. All of the families turn inward to each other. It's siblings, parents, children all turn inward. And if you are single, or if you are just there without a spouse or children, you are just standing there alone for 10 seconds, hoping that someone turns around and kind of looks outward. And so I think the icon of like the marriage bed, the front porch, is so meaningful because I think we should have more of those front porch moments within the church. And not in like a meat market way. I don't need to be set up. You don't need to find the one other single guy in the church. Send him your way, because that's not what church I think should necessarily be for. But a recognition that single people do exist within parishes, again, not simply as support staff or volunteer for everything, but do have a distinct contribution to make. We are there. We should literally count. And so I think you're right. We lack a kind of public recognition of this. I think that's a limitation, but I think that would only make sense if it was someone saying, this is actually the vocation that I would choose for my life. Then I think we really should create some kind of public ritual analogous to vows or to the installation of instituted ministries or something like that to give liturgical acknowledgement to that person.
Don't we do it when we renew our baptismal vows every Easter? Can it be in part in that? I mean, I don't know that it needs a particular celebration. I don't know, it's just an observation. But if it's rooted in baptism, then we all renew that shared covenant in the Easter liturgy.
Can I ask a follow-up question? Just for Elise. That's right. Would you, as for Elise, would you recommend your public theology on the single life for celibate secular priests?
You know, that's actually a question that I have for Rick. Because I noticed throughout his, through Daring Promise, we've got the language of friendship, marriage as friendship, and religious life as friendship. But I don't know where priesthood factors in that. I think actually having that deeper theology and vocation as friendship would do a lot of good for men in the priesthood. To think about how they are still fundamentally relational beings and still need to cultivate healthy friendships with other priests, with lay people, with women. And so I think it's helpful there too to think about this as being the priesthood as one other expression of friendship. But I don't think Sandra Schneider's mentions it that way. It doesn't appear in Daring Promise that way.
Yeah, and the reason I ask is because when you were describing sort of the particular gifts of a single life, this kind of breadth of availability and so on and so forth, that reminds me of the arguments that I've heard over the course of my life and the value of clerical celibacy as being available to a broader, the broader community of the baptized.
So I've seen 3 hands I saw at the microphone, Steve, and then right here.
Briefly, Carlos Mendoza, Department of Theology here at Boston College. A question about the mimetic ecclesiology. I find amazing this connection between Professor Gaillardet's works and other authors in mimetic theory. And if we acknowledge the wounded body of Christ as a locus theologicus for the reformation of the church, what kind of implications do you see for the perpetrators and the victims in the church, outside the church, as a testimony for a process improving a kind of reform, going back to the source of the gospel? Thank you.
In response to that question, I was thinking about actually a book chapter that Roberto Guasuenta wrote, and it had mimetic insights in there, and he was focusing on the biblical scenario of Thomas before Jesus' wounds. And I just think that there's a lot of richness in that element, and I'm going to paraphrase him, but it's not simply a sweeping the wounds or sweeping everything under the rug. It really, that would just make forgiveness cheap. But it really is, forgot Roberto's exact words, but complicity is acknowledged, the wounds are recognized, and that is what allows Thomas to say, "My Lord and my God." That first acclamation of faith for him. And I think that there's something about the promise, and again, I was telling Brian Robinette last night, there's something about the way that Allison writes that is an invitation into a journey that causes self-reflection. And so I wonder if even our ecclesiology, or that is rooted in mimetic ecclesiology, can be written in that genre that invites self-reflection and resists that pointing of fingers first. But it really is a deeper understanding in our polarized context of our equal capacity to turn against our own in the church first. And so there's something about that insight that I would love to develop for the reform of the church. Thank you.
Hi, Steve Pope from Theology. Quick questions for everybody, but I'll focus on Ed because he's been neglected here. And it's a big question, and I just don't think you can solve it right away, but I want you to talk a little bit about the relationship between structures and agency, because you use the word causal in saying that larger structures cause agents to do what they do freely. And I find that puzzling, because normally we talk about causality as leading to certain kinds of actions or behaviors independent of any kind of agency on the part of what's being acted upon. But sometimes you talk about causal effect, and Dan Daly does this too. We have this conversation we have a conversation going on about this. But wouldn't it be better and more accurate to say larger structures influence agents to make choices? It can be highly constrained, channeled, or they can be at the same time in other ways enabled. And that makes room for some degree of agency on the part of human beings. That we're not just like billiard balls banging around a pool table. And if you use the word influence rather than caused, does that have any negative effects on the way that you want to use the critical realist literature?
Yeah, I don't think so. And really, it's in here I mean, if you've had this conversation, I think that he would certainly, see more of the implications. I think that he spent a lot more time with this. Just,
Actually, no, he says it's causal all the way down the line.
Okay. So, to me, at least as far as I've gotten into the literature, my understanding is that, I wouldn't want to talk about a social structure or a culture as an agent. And I think that the causal, the key thing as far as I can understand in the sort of critical realist controversy is that the causal is by means of the enablements and restrictions and incentives that the structure presents to the agent. So I guess I would say, I'd like to ask Dan that question too. What would be, Margaret Archer, what is lost if you talk more about influence? But my sense is that there's something, just the way in which that dilemma, because Archer really, rejects a sort of a determinism. So it's not denying the agency, and I think at least that's the claim, that this is meant precisely to protect agency and at the same time the power of the social structure to influence, to cause. Yeah. Please, jump on in.
I think Steve's raised first of all, I echo what you said. Margaret Archer and other critical realists are very careful not to think about causality in terms of agency. They're very clear that structures aren't agents. They want to preserve that notion. And I think, and Nicholas just pointed this out, there's also an important way in which they don't want to think about causation as monocausal, right? That there are webs or networks of cause causal relations that influence us in various ways. So some of it, I think, is just the model that we have for causality itself, Stephen. I think we may be just using different models for that. I personally am quite comfortable with the language of influence, and I think it gets at what the critical realists are trying to do there in saying that structures shape us, but they don't determine us.
Can I just real quick, I think the lots at stake in this, because you think it's causal, that structures cause people to behave the way they do. You're evacuating,
You're taking away human responsibility and human dignity. If you say structures can powerfully influence human agents, you're saying that what we do is something we're responsible for, and it reflects what we think really matters. So I think saying something is conditioned is different than saying it's caused. There's no doubt about the powerful conditions that operate on all of us, but still, we want to not get rid of the notion of human responsibility. Then there's no ethics, then we don't have a job if we're in moral theology.
No, and yeah.
I just wanted to say, I think one of the reasons the critical realists cling to the causal language is because they want to reclaim what causality means and interpret it not in the determinist sense, as it's been interpreted essentially since the age of mechanistic science, but recover something like the older Aristotelian language of causality, where a cause is something that explains why something is the way it is or why it behaves the way it does. And we need multiple registers of explanation to account for that on the Aristotelian model. And I think the critical realists want to reshape our imagination of causality by using the term in a non-deterministic way. So I would say we should stick with their agenda. That's what I'm thinking.
We have time for one more. I saw Roberta.
Thank you. My name is Rich Andre. I'm the director of the Paulus Center in downtown Boston. I'm going to go back to you, Professor Raby. I hope you can continue to develop this idea. The Paulus Fathers, we are known for having parishes that have lots of single people in them, older single people. I do a lot with young adults, and yet those people still feel that the church has no place for them, in a place that everybody else points to as doing it right. I also am just so intrigued by the idea of the depth versus breadth. As a professor religious, I always have defined my vocation as breadth, and I realize now that there's a lot of different ways of doing breadth, because we talked about diocesan priesthood, religious life, and single life or friendship, whatever you want to call that. Those all have breadths, but they're different. And I haven't stopped thinking about that in the last hour since you brought that up.
Thank you. Yeah, I think you're right. There's a difference in the breadth, and I think one of those is that perhaps for many single people, it's a breadth that is still open to depth. And unlike whether it's the priesthood or vowed religious life, where you have committed to an apostolic availability that also says, and I will not choose a particular marital friendship to go along with that. Whereas I think the single life, because it has so many different forms, but as does marriage, as does religious life, priesthood, some people kind of keep that openness. And I think that is actually the case for a lot of single people. If they're single but perhaps dating, there's a kind of moving in and out of where is the breadth. Do I want to pursue greater depth here or there? So I'm glad that's a helpful framework. I think what Ed said is right, that there's similarity in the kind of apostolic availability of the single life, but in a way that is still different.